Hey guys, in this video, we're going to talk about breathing during a dynamic effort. We're going to look at why ventilation changes and how you should look at volumes and frequency. Okay, Andrew, let's kick it off with the basics here. Why does ventilation change during a dynamic effort?
Yeah, and this is common knowledge in the medical field and in some sports circles, but the really driving force for increasing ventilation, the amount that you breathe during exercise, is a response to the increased amount of carbon dioxide in the system. So it's to eliminate carbon dioxide. You breathe to blow off CO2. Typically, a lot of people will believe or think that you're breathing more to get more oxygen in, and that is a secondary reason for breathing, but the main reason that you are increasing your ventilation is to maintain homeostasis of the pH system, which is tightly controlled in the body between 7.35 and pH of 7.45. And that system is uniquely built to be able to change breath by how much CO2 you blow out. So the more you exercise, the more CO2 your muscles produce. It comes back through the blood system to the lungs. It's measured in the carotid arteries and in the brainstem. And those two systems send signals back to the respiratory system to breathe deeper and faster to blow off the CO2.
Which is really fascinating because, like you said, I thought for a very long time that you breathe more to get more oxygen. A simple way to illustrate that, if you have a pulse oximeter and you put it on your finger, you'll see that your blood is saturated at, say, 97 to 99% pretty much all the time. And if you hold your breath, that number doesn't go down unless you could hold your breath for a very long time when it starts going down. But otherwise, you'll see that your need to breathe is not actually coupled directly to the oxygen. So that's always interesting to look at. So let's jump into it now. What kind of volumes do we want to see somebody breathing during a dynamic effort?
Yeah, so we've talked previously about spirometry and typical volumes for adult males in that 5 to 6 liters of vital capacity, the amount of air that they can blow maximally. And so we're typically aiming for a high range towards the top end of that. So that's sort of 75 to 85% of their vital capacity with each breath.
Are we talking vital capacity here or expiratory volume, like that FEV1? From my reference point, I'm looking at 85% of FEV1 and not vital capacity, because otherwise those volumes become really hard to manage.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because especially as we start pushing the respiratory frequency up, it's a very good point. Use the FEV1 if you're going to use numbers at 75 to 85%. Absolutely.
And then we could definitely see probably a 60 to 85% range on that FEV1. At least that's what I like to look at. And obviously holding those higher percentages is going to be harder. Can you explain why holding really high volumes during an effort is taxing, is hard if you're not trained for it?
Yeah, so the primary way of getting large volumes is really by incorporating and using efficient use of your diaphragm. And the diaphragm is a big, slow twitch muscle fiber that can be trained really well, but it takes a lot of effort to use the diaphragm, especially if you haven't trained it. So to get those numbers at 60 to 85% of your FEV1, you're going to need to incorporate full contraction of the diaphragm. Remember, the diaphragm sits at rest as a dome up into your chest, and as it contracts, it drops down. So the diaphragm contracting is what gives you inspiratory volume, and it takes effort. It takes work to do that. And so maintaining large volumes takes recurrent and repetitive work of the diaphragm. So it's not easy to do. And the other thing, as you start to breathe faster, you also now have to incorporate other muscles, the intercostal muscles, to help exhale the air faster so you can get the next breath in. And that starts to drive even more energy to the respiratory system. And we were talking just earlier about the fact that at high intensity exercises, the respiratory system alone, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, and sometimes the accessory muscles, the muscles in your neck, can use up to 20% of your total cardiac output. So the amount of energy being sent to your body to exercise, up to 20% can be going just to the respiratory system to maintain that homeostasis of the CO2 and oxygen systems.
Yeah, and we know that the body's always going to, let's say, maintain the respiratory system before all the other muscles, because if we don't breathe, we die. So it's high on the priority list. But they're pretty crazy numbers to wrestle with, even if it's 15 to 20% of what you are trying to push around your body that goes to that system. Just shows how important it is. And you talked about frequency there. So what kind of frequencies do we want to see in someone during a dynamic effort, and maybe cover the range of low intensities all the way to maximal intensities?
Yeah. So in a previous video, we were talking about resting values in that kind of 6 to 10 respiratory frequency range. And we see values that go all the way up at the extremely high intensity, up to 60, 70 breaths a minute. The higher those respiratory frequencies goes, the less efficient one can be, because they're blowing so fast they cannot possibly move the same amount of volumes as they can at those low frequencies. So we see that whole range. And at low intensities, we see people that can control jogging paces or low intensity on a watt bike or anything else at those almost resting intensities, that 6 to 10 breaths a minute. And they just increase their tidal volumes, and they, instead of breathing the 500 mils that they would at rest, they're breathing upwards of 3 and 4 liters. And that 4 liter lung volume, tidal volumes, combined with 6 to 10 liters, 6 to 10 breaths per minute of respiratory frequency. So you go 10 times 10, 10 times 4, you can get 40 liters of ventilation at low intensities. And as those numbers climb up, as the respiratory frequency climbs up and someone tries to maintain quite high tidal volumes, we see those ventilation numbers climb from 40 to 60 to 80, pretty high intensity at 100, starting pushing towards a VO2 max intensity or a high intensity effort upwards of over 100 liters a minute. And then as those respiratory frequencies climb into the 50s and 60s, it depends on how much tidal volumes they can maintain, but we have seen people working up even towards 200 liters a minute during exercise. And we have seen values at people that are able to test at rest with special respiratory training devices up into that 250, 300 liters a minute range, which is astounding. We haven't seen those same those same ventilation volumes in people who are exercising, because again, to coordinate those massive ventilation numbers and exercise at the same time is virtually impossible. So that, the upper end range of people while they're either running on a treadmill or biking is, in the high hundreds, low 200s, but still an astounding range if you think about your resting range at 5 to 10 liters a minute and the high end at 200 to 250.
Yeah, it's a huge range to cover, and obviously it's going to depend on what tidal volumes the athlete or you can move, and multiply that by your frequency, and you get your minute ventilation. Is there, Andrew, is there a way to optimize our breathing during a dynamic effort? If there was a basic advice you would give someone to essentially breathe better during a dynamic effort, what would you say?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's debated amongst coaches who do respiratory training about what the best way to breathe is. Historically, many coaches never paid attention to it and just let athletes figure out the best way to breathe themselves. What we've seen is with training and with education, you can actually improve people's efficiency. So instead of drawing more energy to the respiratory system, it's being saved for whatever dynamic sport they're doing, whether they're a cyclist or a runner or a rower. So what we have seen in our anecdotal work is that if you can maximize volumes and reduce respiratory frequency, it's a more efficient pattern of breathing. It does require stronger diaphragm, and it does require coordination that people need to train to be able to do, to be able to sustain that. There's two main reasons for that. One, the larger volumes give access for both CO2 exchange and oxygen exchange to more of the alveoli, which is where that respiratory exchange takes place, more efficiently. And the second reason is the faster you breathe, the more exchange of air is happening in areas that are not actually being perfused by blood. So they actually don't take part in the air exchange process. So you think about the air that's in your mouth, the air that's in your trachea, and the first divisions of the lungs. There's no value to moving air in and out of those areas. So if you go from 20 breaths a minute to 40 breaths a minute, you are literally doubling that, what we call dead space, the space that is air that's being moved in and out of that area. And it's 200 to 300 mils of dead space in a given athlete. So if you double the respiratory frequency from 20 to 40, you are doubling the dead space. You're doubling the amount of air that you have to move that is not actually benefiting your physiology. So if we can reduce the respiratory frequency, there is more efficient exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen through that system. It just requires increased work of the diaphragm and increased control. So it does need to be trained to have that efficiency improvement.
Yeah, such a fascinating topic, and I think we'll do many follow-up videos on this one. But anyway, guys, make sure you like this video. If you have a question on what we talked about or a follow-up question, drop it in the comments below, and we will see you in the next video. Take care.